My name is Ben Rybeck. I'm the general manager at House of Books here in Kent, Connecticut. And it is a great privilege tonight to have David Leff and Eric Lehman joining us to talk about their new book, New England Nature. It's a subject that is, of course, near and dear to our heart here in Kent, and we are, of course, honored, as always, to be presenting this event and so many other events with our dear friends and partners in crime at the Kent Memorial Library. So a big thank you to them, as always. I want to just mention quickly that House of Books has been independently owned and operated in Kent, Connecticut for 45 years now. We have a web store where, of course, you can purchase a copy of New England Nature. The link is easy to remember, hopefully. It's houseofbooksct.com/New England Nature. So we'll put that in the chat here in a minute. But please buy a copy, support us, support these authors. I think you will find it to be a collection that is absolutely delightful and really shines a light on sort of why those of us who live in New England choose to do so. I also want to mention that we will have an opportunity at the end of the conversation this evening for questions. So as you're listening, please think of some questions, put them in the Q&A function down there at the bottom. We will get to as many as we can. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to the Adult Programs and Special Events Director at the Kent Memorial Library, to talk a little bit about what they do and to introduce tonight's speakers, Brittany McAllister. Thank you, Brittany.
Thank you, Ben. It's so great to host these events with you, especially with amazing authors like we have tonight. And I just wanted to thank everyone for being here. Like Ben mentioned, I'm the Adult Programs and Special Events Director at Kent Memorial Library. We are open, just in case anyone wasn't sure. You can make an appointment by calling or just knocking on the door. We have a new exhibit up inside the library that we would love everyone to see called Visions and Variety, 7 different local artists that are up on our walls. So please stop by and say hello to us when you have a chance. And before we get started, I just wanted to give you some background on our amazing speakers this evening. David K. Leff is an award-winning essayist, former Deputy Commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Environmental Protection, and Poet Laureate, Town Meeting Moderator, and Historian of Canton, Connecticut. He is the author of 6 nonfiction books, 3 volumes of poetry, and 2 novels in verse, including The Breach, Voices Haunting a New England Milltown. His 2016 travel adventure, Canoeing Maine's legendary Allagash, Thoreau, Romance, and Survival of the Wild, won a silver medal in the Nautilus Book Awards for memoir and a silver medal in the Independent Publisher Book Awards for regional nonfiction. Another Thoreau-oriented book, Deep Travel, in Thoreau's wake on the Concord and Merrimack, was published in 2009 by the University of Iowa Press. In 2016-2017, the National Park Service appointed David Poet in Residence for the New England National Science Scenic Trail. His journals, correspondence, and other papers are archived at the University of Massachusetts Libraries in Amherst. And of course, Eric B. Lehman is an associate professor at the University of Bridgeport and the author or editor of 19 books: Insider's Guide to Connecticut, A Connecticut Christmas, Connecticut Waters, Connecticut Town Greens, Quotable New Englander, Yankees New England Adventures, and New England at 400, from Plymouth Rock to present day, just to name a few. His biography of Charles Stratton, Becoming Tom Thumb, won the Henry Russell Hitchcock Award from the Victorian Society of America and was chosen as one of the American Library Association's Outstanding University Press Books of the Year. His novella, Shadows of Paris, was the novella of the year from the Next Gen Indie Book Awards, won a silver medal for romance from the Forward Review Indie Book Awards, and was a finalist for the Connecticut Book Award. So as you can see, we are so lucky to have them with us tonight. Thank you both, and I will give it over to you.
Hello, hello. So I'm very excited to be here tonight to talk to you. I see we have a number of participants who I, for some reason, can't see on my video, but I'm going to tell you tonight a little bit about the book itself and why we wrote it, how we wrote it, and then David's going to talk to you. Then we're going to share some excerpts from the book with you, just to show you the breadth and the depth of what we found. So when we were tasked with writing this book, we had the idea and we sent it to the publishers. And as you know, publishers sometimes put restrictions on you as writers. And so we really had to focus on the first 300 years of New England history. So that was that cut out modern writers. Like I would like to include David in the book since he's a New England nature writer, but he's out. So and the other restriction, which David particularly was upset about, was that we were not going to include any poetry. So at first we were a little taken aback by these restrictions, and then it turned out to be an amazing opportunity because we got to get into some people and some writers and some writing that people had not touched yet. We wanted, of course, to include the writers that everybody knows, Thoreau and Emerson and Amy Lowell and big writers, but we wanted also to dig deep, and that was really David's job. He really dug deep into the old Appalachia magazines and old Forests and Streams, and really did a lot of deep dive. My job was to go broad and really, I made a list. I think it was like 500 New England writers, and went through their oeuvres and found stuff. What does Harriet Beecher Stowe have? And well, she's got a lot of novels, but she also had some amazing nature writing. And so to find that and find the little gems, which people haven't read, and some which people haven't even seen for over 100 years. And so that was really exciting. And we found, writing from that span the entire realm of writing. We have science-based writing or pseudoscience-based writing. We have environmental writing, what we would call activist writing. We found descriptive and spiritual writing. We found all kinds of things, and often they were from very surprising people. We had P.T. Barnum writing against billboards. You think, oh, P.T. Barnum, the advertiser. Nope, he's writing and saying billboards are a bad thing. We have somebody writing about fishing for trout. We have people writing about the beach, writing about the swamp, writing about the mountains, writing about what you're doing in nature, like maple sugaring, or the bad effects of lighthouses on birds. We think about the new, people are worried about birds running into windmills. Well, they were running into lighthouses back then. Things like we wanted to include fiction. We wanted to include people like Benjamin Silliman, who was, the first account of a meteor strike. So this was a opportunity, we thought, to really find what New England was all about, what their writing in New England was all about. And I think that you'll be very pleased with what we found, and we're excited to share a little bit of it with you tonight. David, if you would like to take over for a minute and tell everybody what New England nature writing is. What's the character of New England nature writing?
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, I want to talk about what makes the New England voice in nature writing distinctive. And, it's kind of a hard thing to pin down, to distinguish it from other places, but I have a few thoughts on it. And I think the first distinctive thing, the thing that makes New England nature writing somewhat unique, is the land itself. Individuals develop an intimate relationship with this countryside because it's both at a human scale and fairly easily accessible. It may lack the monumental character of landscapes out west, for example, but it's a landscape of fine detail and astounding, if sometimes subtle, beauty. And also there's been centuries of cycles of use and healing, exploitation, And you can see the remains of that if you take a walk in the woods or elsewhere along the seashore, pretty much anywhere. I mean, there's everything from Native American rock shelters and middens to farm stone walls. There's old mill dams and sluiceways from small scale and even larger scale industry. There's even old roads that are 20th century paved roads, such as Baldwin Drive up on top of West Rock. And there are Nike missile sites buried in the woods in places like Meshamasik State Forest down in Portland, Connecticut. So you not only have a natural landscape, but you have a landscape that has a relationship, a long-term relationship with people. And because of the nature of our landscape, because it's so forgiving, because it heals, it makes it that much more interesting and distinctive. Also, it's a landscape of proximity and diversity. There's so much that is near at hand. Their seashore and mountains are not far apart. Hard scrabble areas with bedrock exposed and areas of deep agricultural soils, also not very far apart. So it's a very diverse landscape, and you can go from one thing to another relatively quickly, more quickly than you can in most places. And that's another distinction. It's also a landscape where nature and culture are intertwined. You can be deep in the woods or on a mountaintop in the morning, and then later that day you could go to the theater or a concert. You can paddle a wild and scenic river, and later in the evening you could go to a professional ball game or have a dine in some of the finest restaurants in the world. So it's proximity, it's intimacy. There are a number of factors, but I think also it's also the culture of New England people that makes a difference. And at the outset, I want to acknowledge the stewardship of Native Americans on this continent for centuries before the coming of Europeans. And we dearly wanted to include some Native American voices, but we found it very difficult because in the time frame in which the book covers, writings that had to do with Native Americans were about them by other people, not by them. And so that was very difficult for us to realize that there really wasn't a lot of literature to tap in that regard. There's much more that can be found now, and also out west there are more native voices that survived in their own voice. Also, early farmers toiled on relatively small plots of land here, and they got to know them very well. In the 18th and 19th century, our seaports brought not only wealth, but they also brought ideas from many, many places, and that played an important role. The Industrial Revolution had its start here in New England, and it not only resulted in the despoiling of a lot of the natural world, but because of that, it made people realize how important it was to preserve what we have. And much of the effort to protect nature came out of what the excesses of the Industrial Revolution. And lastly, with the exception of Boston, our cities are relatively small, and especially before the middle of the 20th century, when sprawl ran amok. It wasn't very hard to get out of the cities and explore the countryside. So I think those factors, both the land and the people, have made a big difference. And just one other thing is that we've also had a relatively highly educated population here from the beginning. Institutions of learning, the Many of the early ones were founded here. So, and that led to a contemplative view of the natural world, such as, Timothy Dwight from Yale traveling through New England and New York and recording the beauty of the landscape, and not just as a practical adjunct to agriculture or industry. So that is at least my take on what gives New England nature writing a distinctive voice. And now let's hear a little bit of that. And I'll turn it back to Eric, and he'll read an excerpt from one of the authors in the book.
So I'm going to start with a guy named John Jocelyn, and he's not really somebody whose name you've probably heard. He was an Englishman who came over here in the 1630s, and he wrote a book called New England Rarities, discovered in birds, beasts, fishes, serpents, and plants of that country. And this was sort of an early natural history book, and even someone like Thoreau had read this and looked back on it and thought, well, at least he tried. His book was criticized by many, even at the time, as being overly credulous of whatever tale he was told. He's in good company, somebody like Herodotus. If you've ever read Herodotus's histories of Egypt, the stuff he says about the pyramids, for example, is just nonsense. It's just whatever the tour guide told him. And much the same thing happened to John Jocelyn. He came and he asked everybody questions about it. And I think a lot of people were pulling his leg, but he didn't get it. So I'm going to read a little section from the section that we took. We took some about bears and raccoons and porcupines and beavers. I'm going to read this stuff about the bears that he has in New England here. Feel free to laugh if that is comes up. The bear, which are generally black. The bear. They live 4 months in caves, that is, all winter. In the spring, they bring forth their young ones. They seldom have above 3 cubs in a litter, are very fat in the fall of the leaf with feeding upon acorns, at which time they are excellent venison. Their brains are venomous. They feed much upon the water plantain in the spring and summer, and berries, and also upon a shellfish called a horsefoot, and are never mankind, i.e. fierce, but in rutting time. And then they walk the country 20, 30, 40 in a company, making a hideous noise with roaring, which you may hear a mile or 2 before they come so near as to endanger the traveler. About 4 years since, acorns being very scarce up in the country, some numbers of them came down amongst the English plantations, which generally are by the seaside. At one town called Gorgiana in the province of Maine, they killed 80. He also gives some, that never happened, just so in case you thought there was a troop of bears coming down from the mountains to kill.
Are you sure?
80 people in the town. He also gives us some advice on how to use parts of the bear. So he says, their grease is very good for aches and cold swellings. The Indians anoint themselves therewith from top to toe, which hardens them against the cold weather. A black bear's skin heretofore was worth 40 shillings. Now you may have one for 10. Much used by the English for beds and coverlets, and by the Indians for coats. These bear skins were apparently good for pain and lameness upon cold. One Edward Andrews, being foxed, which is a word for drunk, and falling backward across a thwart in a shallop or fisher boat, and taking cold upon it, grew crooked, lame, and full of pain. Was cured, lying one winter upon bear's skins newly flayed off, with some upon him, so that he sweat every night. So partially you got some good information in there, and some which is just absolute nonsense. And we found that that was much the case in a lot of that early nature writing. But as Thoreau said about Jocelyn, at least he was trying to focus on this natural history of New England. Very, very funny stuff. I'll throw it back to David.
Okay, I'm not so sure that Jocelyn isn't right. You know, I think they're just trying to hide the truth. So I'm going to read an excerpt from an essay by Noah Webster. And of course, all of you know about his dictionary, and his birthplace is in West Hartford. It's a museum and well worth visiting. But he wrote this essay in 1817, and it appeared in a couple of newspapers, and including the Hartford Courant on April 22nd, 1817, a date that today is Earth Day. Which is very interesting considering what this essay is about. It's called Domestic Economy, but it's really a very prescient and early advocacy of good forestry and energy conservation. And these are two issues that are probably as important, if not more important today than they were in Webster's time. So it's eerily prescient when you read this. So I'll read a little excerpt from it. Domestic economy. When our ancestors first planted their habitations in this country, the first object was to clear the land for tillage, mowing, and pasture. Wood was an encumbrance, and it was consumed without regard to quantity. In conformity with this object, wide and deep fireplaces were constructed, for it was less labor to roll in heavy logs than to cut and split them. Almost 2 centuries have elapsed since this work of destruction has been carried on without intermission. Our habits have been formed upon this practice, and the annual consumption of 30 or 40 cords of wood by a family is considered as necessary and a matter of course. Provident men, however, begin to cast about for a means of saving fuel. In truth, our country cannot sustain the present consumption of wood for a century to come. We must either reduce the annual consumption within the limits of the annual growth, or that time will arrive when we must search the bowels of the earth for fuel. And if we are not able to find it in the interior of New England, we must import it, or we must abandon the soil. It is of the more importance to attend in season to this object, as some future time we must depend on more, our manufacturers must depend on more for our clothing and utensils than we now do. And how are our manufactories to be supplied with fuel? The first object that requires attention is to nourish and increase the growth of trees for fuel and timber. Every farm should contain a tract of land covered with trees, the annual growth of which should be equal to the necessities of one family at least. Experienced farmers will best judge of the best mode of treating woodland for the preservation of the wood and for encouraging the most rapid growth. The next object is to reduce the amount of consumption. Within a few years past, much attention has been paid to this object, and many experiments have been made, some of them with no inconsiderable success. The great point to be gained in the use of fuel is to confine the heat and prevent its escape in the current of air which it generates, and by which combustion is supported. In our common fireplaces, a great part of the heat is entirely lost. And then a little further on, he writes this: our country has been favored beyond example for many years past in agricultural and commercial prosperity. The effect of this has been not only to furnish the means of improvement, but the means of buying and ambition. We are habitually disposed to spend all we can get and something more. And under a depressed state of business, these habits become extremely inconvenient. But it is the ordinance of Providence that men should live within their means. We must come to this sooner or later and adapt our manner of life to our circumstances. With a determination to do this, we shall soon find that we are not forsaken by a bountiful providence,
But we are not merely to seek the means of subsistence for ourselves. We are not to waste and destroy for the sake of the present enjoyment. We must not strip the inheritance of its wood and its fences and its timber and leave it barren and impoverished to the next generation. We must not be so improvident as to render our country uninhabitable. Cold as the climate is, New England may, and with provident management, forever supply food and fuel to a numerous population. Now, the language is somewhat antiquated. It's over 200 years old, but the sentiment is as contemporary as any environmental writing today. It's pretty amazing, pretty amazing. Eric?
Thank you so much, David. I loved hearing that again from your voice, the Webster. It's really, it's so amazing that he's writing that so far ahead of time. And then, that's amazing.
It is indeed.
So, we've heard of scientific, if you can call Jocelyn scientific writing. We've heard one about the environment, plea for the environment. I'm going to share you one that is much more elegaic and sort of spiritual almost about nature. And this is a fascinating person for this to come from. It's not Ralph Waldo Emerson or somebody you might think of like that, but rather W.E.B. Dubois. He is from Great Barrington, Massachusetts. He's the first African-American to get a doctorate from Harvard. Of course, he helped found the NAACP. His book, Souls of Black Folk, was one of the seminal works of nonfiction of the 20th century. If you go to the Modern Library, like best American books of the 20th, it's I think it's at number 3. It's really an important book. He was an important thinker in the early 20th century, but he also wrote beautifully about nature. And so that was really amazing to find nature writing in his memoirs. This is from a memoir called Dark Water that he wrote. And it's about Maine. It's about Mount Desert Island, Bar Harbor. And so some of you who've been there might hear some echoes of your own experience there. Bar Harbor lies beneath a mighty mountain, a great bare black mountain that sleeps above the town. But as you leave, it rises suddenly, threateningly, until far away on Frenchman's Bay, it looms above the town in withering vastness, as if to call all that little world petty, save itself. Beneath the cool, wide stare of that great mountain, men cannot live as giddily as in some lesser summer's playground. Before the unveiled face of nature, as it lies naked on the Maine coast, rises a certain human awe. God molded his world largely and mightily off this marvelous coast, and meant that in the tired days of life, men should come and worship here and renew their spirit. This I have done, and turning I go to work again. As we go, ever the mountains of Mount Desert rise and greet us on our going, somber, rock-ribbed, and silent, looking unmoved on the moving world, yet conscious of their everlasting strength. About us beats the sea, the sail-flecked, restless sea, humming its tune about our flying keel, unmindful of the voices of men. The land sinks to meadows, black pine forests, with here and there a blue and wistful mountain. Then there are islands, bold rocks above the sea, curled meadows. Through and about them roll ships, weather-beaten and patched of sail, strong-holed and smoking, light gray and shining. All the colors of the sea lie about us, gray and yellowing greens and doubtful blues. Blacks not quite black, tinted silvers and golds, and dreaming whites. Long tongues of dark and golden land lick far out into the tossing waters, and the white gulls sail and scream above them. It is a mighty coast, ground out and pounded, scarred, crushed, and carven in massive, frightful lineaments. Everywhere stand the pines, the little dark and steadfast pines that smile not, neither weep, but wait and wait. Near us lie aisles of flesh and blood, white cottages, tiled and meadowed. Afar lie shadowlands, high mist-hidden hills, mountains boldly limbed, yet shading to the sky, faint and unreal. We skirt the pine-clad shores, chary of men, and know how bitterly winter kisses these lonely shores to fill yon row of beaked ice houses that creep up the hills. We are sailing due westward, and the sun, yet 2 hours high, is blazoning a fiery glory on the sea that spreads and gleams like some broad jeweled trail, to where the blue and distant shadowland lifts its carven front aloft, leaving, as it gropes, shades of shadows beyond. Whew. That was that was a little much for me. That was moving. So I'll throw it back to David for another section of 20th century writing here.
Thank you, Eric. You know, that excerpt just goes to show that there are so many writers that we included that you would never think of as nature writers, and yet their work is inspired by nature, and they write so evocatively about it, which in fact demonstrates the power that nature has over their spirits. And I'm going to continue along those lines, because I'm going to conclude by reading an excerpt from Edith Wharton. Of course, she's a novelist, and we do include works of fiction in the book. Usually, the essay form is usually considered most appropriate to nature writing, but there's some beautiful nature writing in fiction, including in Edith Wharton. Now, she was born to wealth in New York. She was the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize in fiction. The mansion home that she built in Lenox, Massachusetts, the Mount, is a museum that's open to the public and well worth visiting. Now, she wrote a lot about landscape and landscape architecture. She did write some nonfiction in that and other fields, but not really nature writing. Now, I'm going to read an excerpt from a book called Ethan Frome, which some of you might be familiar with. It's much different than most of her other fiction books, in that it's about a poor New Englander. Most of her books are about issues between very wealthy people, often those who are in Europe or have experienced Europe. So this is a little different. But in this case, the character of Ethan Frome and the landscape in which he lives are so tightly wound together that sometimes, as you're reading the book, it is hard to tell one from the other. I'll read a couple sections, and this first section mentions a bay, which is a kind of horse, not an inlet on the ocean or a lake. And it's in our book we entitled it Starkfield. That's where Ethan Frome lives, and this excerpt is particularly about experience in Starkfield. So, Starkfield. The next morning, when I looked out, I saw the hollow-backed bay between the Varnum spruces, and Ethan Frome, throwing back his worn bearskin, made room for me in the sleigh at his side. After that, for a week, he drove me over every morning to Corbury Flats, and on my return in the afternoon, met me again and carried me back through the icy night to Starkfield. The distance each way was barely 3 miles, but the old bay's pace was slow. And even with firm snow under the runners, we were nearly an hour on the way. Ethan Frome drove in silence, the reins loosely held in his left hand, his brown seamed profile under the helmet-like peak of his cap, relieved against the banks of snow like a bronze image of a hero. He never turned his face to mine, or answered, except in monosyllables, the questions I put, or slight pleasantries as I ventured. He seemed a part of the mute, melancholy landscape, an incarnation of its frozen woe. And with all that was warm and sentient in him, fast bound below the surface. But there was nothing unfriendly in his silence. I simply felt that he lived in a depth of moral isolation too remote for casual access. And I had the sense that his loneliness was not merely the result of his personal plight, tragic as I guessed that to be, but had in it the profound accumulated cold of many stark field winters. So we'll move a little on in the novel, and I'll read another short excerpt. As he lay there, the window pane that faced him, growing gradually lighter, inlaid upon the darkness a square of the moon, suffused sky. A crooked tree branch crossed it, a branch of the apple tree under which on summer evenings he had sometimes found Mattie sitting when he came up from the mill. Slowly, the rim of the rainy vapors caught fire and burnt away, and a pure moon swung into the blue. Ethan, rising on his elbow, watched the watched the landscape whiten and shape itself under the sculpture of the moon. This was the night on which he was to have taken Mattie coasting, and there hung the lamp to light them. He looked out at the slopes bathed in luster, the silver-edged darkness of the woods, the spectral purple of the hills against the sky, and it seemed as though all the beauty of the night had been poured out to mock his wretchedness. He fell asleep, and when he woke, the chill of the winter dawn was in the room. He felt cold and stiff and hungry, and ashamed of being hungry. He rubbed his eyes and went to the window. A red sun stood over the gray rim of the fields behind trees that looked black and brittle. Now, that's not a book of from a book of nature writing. It's a novel about characters, and a very compelling novel at that. And yet, that's some of the most beautiful nature writing you will ever read. It's just amazing. And as Eric pointed out at the beginning, that was part of the joy of this project, is not only discovering writers that whose voices had been silenced for so long and being able to put them back in print, but to also focus on the nature writing of those who aren't considered nature writers per se. So I want to thank you for joining us. And now we'd be delighted to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I was actually curious to ask, are there other fiction writers who you think were particularly skilled at sort of communicating the essence of nature of New England, of the New England landscape in their works? Like, who else kind of comes to mind other than like Edith Wharton in that book?
Well, we included Nathaniel Hawthorne, of course. You know, his nature is always a symbol in his books. David has more to say about him, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, you know, the excerpt that we included in the book is from the short story, The Great Stone Face, which is about the old man in the mountain in New Hampshire, which collapsed some years ago, but is still considered the symbol of the state. And it's about a boy and his mother, and the power that that aspect of the landscape holds over them, and how it moves and motivates them. It's surprising. The more you delve into fiction writing in New England, the more you'll find real nuggets of beauty, sandwiched into dialogue and description that moves one character from one place to another.
Yeah, I think one of the projects that we had with this book, and it was an accidental project, was, nature writing often gets put in a little genre box, and you put it's on one shelf there in Barnes and Noble, and nature writing. And in fact, nature writing is all writing, and all writing is nature writing. And so being able to include not just this, what we normally think of as nonfiction essay form, nature writing like Walden, and including other things was really, I thought, something that I was proud that we did.
Are there any, and by the way, yeah, anyone who has a question, please go ahead and put it in the Q&A down there. But or send it to us directly. But I did also want to ask you, what about other narrative? What about other narrative arts like film or even like, I don't know, or television or theater or even some non-narrative arts like the visual arts? Like, is there anyone who's sort of like any particular works or people who really kind of stand out there? Like if you were to kind of broaden this into something that was more multimedia oriented, like where would you turn first?
Well, I mean, obviously today documentary nature programming is ubiquitous, and this was once something we could only get on PBS, and now it's everywhere, and we can stream it. But I think that what you're asking is if we can find it in the works of other people and in the works of filmmakers and tell people who pay attention to nature like that. Boy,
Well,
I think of a New Englander who does that. I'm not sure I can.
Yeah, I'm not sure about New Englanders, but any film that has an outdoor background, or where events take place in the outdoors, whether it's Spencer Tracy in Northwest Passage or Jeremiah Johnson, these movies say a lot about nature to the audience, and sometimes they're not exactly correct. I watched a movie recently which was supposed to take place in New England, and I'm looking at the landscape and say, that tree doesn't grow here. That's from California, or in this case, it was from Idaho. Or sometimes you'll hear California frogs in a New England, a movie about New England or the Northeast. So, I think sometimes movie directors don't do the proper research, or they think the public isn't going to notice, and most people probably don't. But it tends to irk me a little bit, and I think nowadays people are more careful about that kind of thing. But there was a period where movies were made in California, and they kind of fit the narrative to the landscape that they had.
So one question I have here is since you both were already coming into this project so researched and knowledgeable about New England and Connecticut, was there anything that was like truly surprising to you that you discovered when you were creating this book?
Well, yeah,
I mean, really sticks out to you.
Yeah, this was because Eric found this, but there's an excerpt from one of Helen Keller's writings in here, and it is just amazing. I mean, this is a woman who can't see, can't hear, so her nature description is all by tactile means, all by sense of touch, and it's beautiful, it's evocative, and it is so different than what the mass of people experience in nature. That was a revelation to me, and also helped me emphasize another dimension of my experience of the outdoors. I'm very grateful to Eric for for pointing this piece out, because I really had no idea. So that, for me, that was one of the great discoveries in this process.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was actually excited that we were able to put so much humor in the book as well.
Yeah.
And, Mark Twain's description of New England weather is famous, but it was worth reading again, and then I read things out loud, and I was like, oh my God, this is funny. No wonder people loved Mark Twain, but not just him, the John Jocelyn one I read, and Samuel Peters from the 1700s. These are writers who are writing about nature, but writing about it with a sort of, little glint in their eye. And that was a different kind of nature writing than what we're used to from, say, Thoreau, or, this, or more the imitators of Thoreau, this sort of, spiritual, I'm taking nature too seriously genre. So we have some of those too, but we wanted to include some of those, and I thought that was really great.
Was there anything that you had to leave out that it absolutely killed you to leave out, other than
Poetry.
the poetry?
Yeah,
Although we
I
did
mean,
sneak in Emily Dickinson as an epigraph.
we
Yeah,
did sneak that in.
Snuck it in, right?
Some of the ones from the mid 20th century, I was upset we couldn't get in there, like
Yeah.
Henry Beston's The Outermost House, piece from Cape Cod. So that was something that I wish we had been able to get in. Yeah.
So I'm curious to know, when you're working on a book about nature, and this is a question actually I also got, that when you're working, or it's sort of combining it with a question I got, but when you're working on a book about nature, do you feel like, how to phrase it? Do you feel like you need to be in nature to sort of think about it, to sort of put you in the mindset where you can work on it, or is that as simple as just sort of sitting by a good window in your house? Like, where do you do the work for this kind of book, like physically? Are we looking at it?
We both have pretty good views from our office windows, I know David tries to get outside and do something out in nature every day if he can, and so do I. So I mean,
Sure.
that's it's dark outside, or I'd show you the view of my window. But that's yeah, I did some of the book sitting on my porch, which is, there's a stream there and forest. So
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at the space in which I work, but what you can't see is my office is filled with natural objects that inspire me. I got birds' nests and white-faced hornets' nests, and a horseshoe crab shell, and all sorts of rocks, and deer antlers, and a caribou antler I got in Labrador when I was canoeing up there. So I have a room that not only is filled with the books that you see, my own little house of books, but also filled with objects that I find in the woods. So, each object, a beaver chewed stick, each one has a story and a personal experience, because they are all objects that I have found. Birds' eggs, and all sorts of little pieces of the natural world. So I look at those, and those help bring me back to the places where I found them, whether it was on the seashore or in the mountains or out in the wilds of Labrador. And so that helps give me some inspiration, even though when I do my writing, I'm inside.
yeah, for sure. I'm looking at a deer skull right now, and behind me is my grandfather's arrowheads that he found. So same thing. Yes.
I have another question here. If you could describe New England nature to someone who had never visited or seen photos, what key points would you make?
Ooh. Oh man.
Well,
I like what David said earlier about close by, being how nature is we're interacting with it in much closer than, I mean, obviously we don't have as big a mountains or as wide of plains, but it's all right there. And, you know, I can walk out my door and be in the forest in a minute. And I think almost everyone can drive 5 minutes and be there from wherever they are in Connecticut or New England in general. David, what would
Right.
you like?
Yeah, I mean, I would call it a kind of intimacy, a marriage of nature and culture.
Mm.
You know, nature is around us, but also even if you want to get to a fairly remote place, you know, it doesn't take too long. You don't have to drive an entire day to get there. And there are fascinating pockets of nature within walking distance of where most people live, or a short drive at the very most.
David wrote another book. I thought I had it here. David wrote a book about that called Terra Nexus. And so about that, the marriage of nature and culture. So I encourage everybody who's interested in that to take a look at that.
This might be an impossible question, but where sort of along this line, let's say you were talking to someone who said, I hate New England, never have any interest in it, don't want to go there, don't want to live there, don't even want to visit there. What one place would you take them to? It's going to change their mind.
Mount Washington, Cape Cod, those are the dramatic ones, you know. I think the beach at Cape Cod is, you know, take them out there and read from Thoreau, you know, or Henry Beston about Cape Cod.
Yeah.
The knife edge on Mount Katahdin.
The knife edge, yeah.
You know, I mean, it's remote, it's hard to get to, but it's such a breathtakingly magnificent place, especially because, you know, Katahdin isn't just like a single summit. There's that vast tableland above tree line. You know, on a clear day, which you don't always get, you can see, you know, just what looks like endless forests and lakes shining like silver platters, one after the other. But just the raw element of nature, the rock and the lichen and the almost as if it's unfinished from the hand of the creator. And that's where I would take them, to Mount Katahdin.
I'm going to say Mohegan Island. I think that would be.
Yeah, that would be a great place too.
It has that little tiny village, which is very New England, and it's 10 miles from the coast, and it's just, yeah, you know, that to me is like New England in miniature right there.
Yeah, that's where nature and culture are intimate. They're married there.
I think one last question before we wrap it up. Is there any other region that of the United States that you feel compelled, that you would ever feel compelled to do a book like this about? Like if you had to do a book like this about another region, what would that be?
Pacific Northwest, maybe.
Yeah.
But I think that's as close as, you know, I don't know. It's a tough. I'm sure there's, you know, I grew up in Pennsylvania. So you have somebody like John James Audubon there, and you've got Daniel Boone, and you know, all that stuff, and so maybe I'd go back and investigate that a little bit more.
Yeah, I would agree with Eric on the Pacific Northwest, but also it would be a toss-up with the northern reaches of the Midwest. You know, the borderland of Minnesota and Wisconsin, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Those are fabulous places. Those are for nature, and also have a very distinctive culture about them.
Hemingway's Last Good Country up there. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Eric. Thank you, David. Thank you both so much for being here. Thank you to the Kent Memorial Library. Thank you to everybody who joined us tonight. I just want to mention again, please pick up a copy of the book. You can order it online at houseofbooksct.com/New England Nature, or swing by. We are open for masked and limited capacity customer browsing, but we are open, so swing on by. Eric, David, once again, thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you.
And have a good night to everyone.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.